Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all safe and doing well. My name is Jurjin Akasha. I'm together with my team. We're going to discuss the continuation of the law and government, which is the part two, beginning with the topic of legitimacy. Okay, as you can see on the screen, there is a basic definition of legitimacy, where it states that a government is seen as having the right to rule. Legitimacy means the government or authority is accepted by the people. And since they are accepted by the people, they are being recognized as rightful either by law, tradition, or public support. Now we have to take note of the importance of legitimacy in the government. It helps maintain order and stability. It affects how courts, citizens, and other countries respond to government actions because without legitimacy, even a powerful government may face resistance or collapse. All right. Under political or under legitimacy, we're going to talk about political questions. Political questions are questions that are concerned with issues dependent upon the wisdom, not the legality of a particular measure. So, in this regard, since it states there that it's not about legality, these questions are not concerning. These are not concerning whether something is lawful or unlawful, but rather about wisdom or judgment. What is the best or most appropriate decision on that particular question? Now, if that's political question, who then decides political questions? Who has the authority to decide about it? Now, as you can see on the slides, political questions are to be decided by the people in their sovereign capacity. It could also be through the branches of the government, namely legislative or executive. So, questions concerning political, these are usually left to the people. First is the people. People may vote, through voting, public opinion. It could also be the branches of the government vested, or we have legislative vested upon the Congress. We also have the executive, which is the president. So in this matter, the Constitution gives them full authority to decide on these matters. This is to respect the doctrine of separation of powers. And why is it important? We have to remember that political questions or in political questions, courts often avoid ruling on this matter. Why? Because these are questions not about interpreting laws. These questions are just about policy choices, which are better made by elected officials or the public. I'm sorry. Alright, going to the next slide for continuation. Yes, it is not the court's discretion to entertain political question unless, however, referred to the Article 8, Section 1 of the 1987 Constitution to determine whether or not there has been a grave abuse of discretion amounting to lack or excess jurisdiction on the part of any branch or instrumentality of the government. Regarding political questions, courts are sometimes misunderstood. People think that court can interfere in matters that should be handled by lawmakers or policy experts, like as what I've mentioned earlier. It could be legislative or best example is legislative department. But this perception is wrong, actually. The court has a clear role. You can see that in Article 8 of Section 1 of the 1987 Constitution. Political and economic decisions, these are usually based on wisdom or judgment, not strict with legality. So, the court does not judge whether a policy is smart or effective, only whether it's constitutional or unconstitutional. So, in that regard, political question doctrine says that some issues are not for the courts to decide because they are politically inclined. Um, but it's not like it's not like a magic shield, actually, that just because something is labeled as political doesn't mean it's automatically valid or legal. The court also has the duty, where it is stated in the 1987 Constitution, that the court must the laws review the laws and executive actions to see if they follow the Constitution, of course. It must also check if any part of the government has abused its power or gone beyond its limit. So what does it mean? In Article 8, Section 1 of the 1987 Constitution, still, even in matters concerning political question, the court has the authority or the power to decide and check whether there has been a grave abuse of discretion amounting to lack or excess jurisdiction of that particular question. Alright, we're now on the next slide, where a government cannot recognize its own acts, because recognition connotes the acknowledgement by a party of the acts of another. We have to remember that even branches of the government cannot recognize its own actions, because when we talk about recognition, it means we acknowledge. It is the act of acknowledging someone else's action, not your own, of course. So recognition usually means one party accepts or acknowledges what another party did. Example, let's have an example. If a lower officer follows orders from higher officer, do you think it's recognition? That's not recognition. That's obedience. That's a mere obedience. The law officer is not recognizing the higher officer's act. They are just carrying it out. Now, obedience means doing what you're being told by someone above you, while recognition means saying, alright, I accept this, I accept what you did, usually someone else, not yourself. Now, individual members of Congress or other government bodies cannot make official acts of recognitions on their own. For an act to be valid, it must be done collectively in a formal session, of course, unless a law allows otherwise. And in the Philippines, there is no such law that allows a single body of government to act on its own, to recognize acts of recognitions on their own. This is a well-established rule in administrative law and, of course, the law of public officers. Now, recognition, to take note, recognition is often considered as political question, because recognition is a matter of political, it is a matter of policy, discretion, and not, of course, legality. However, we must consider that if you may have read the book of Aquino, you would understand that the passage shows there that even political question must follow legal procedures. Okay, so while the substance of recognition may be political, the process must still meet legal standards. Alright, we're now on our next slide, legitimacy and political question in the Aquino government. This is actually an example that best illustrates the concept of political questions and legitimacy. I know we're all aware that after EDSA revolution, there were a lot of changes made by the former President Aquino. From 1973 Constitution, creating a Freedom Constitution, and the 1987 Constitution, which is still in effect as up until today. If you would imagine, that's a big change. That's a big change, actually. And because of that change, people have asked, is Aquino's government legal? Now, refer to the slide. The Supreme Court said yes. It was in control, it was recognized by other countries, and it is even supported by many people. Now, even though it didn't follow the usual legal steps, it was still legitimate. And that's how political and legitimacy work together. Sometimes history and public support matter more than strict legal rules. So even after the revolution or the EDSA revolution, some people may say that Aquino's government wasn't legal at all because it didn't follow the old constitution. But the Supreme Court said, actually, this isn't a legal question. It's a political one. And the people already accepted her as a president. If you can still remember, right from the very beginning of this discussion, I've mentioned earlier that there is legitimacy when people accepts the authority or the government to rule or to make such decision. And yes, by people already accepting Aquino or accepted President Aquino by that time, that makes her government legitimate. And courts, of course, don't decide who should lead after revolution. The people should, and the people do. And it shows that legitimacy can come from public acceptance, not just legal procedures. And it now highlights how political questions are beyond the court's reach, especially matters like this, revolutionary transition. Alright, we're now on our next subtopic, which is constitutionalism and constitutional supremacy. Jurisprudence tells us that constitution is a definition of the powers of government, where 5 major powers delegated to the following. We have Congress, President, Judiciary, constitutional commissions, and local government units. Now, we have to remember as well the doctrine of separation of powers, that each of the branches of the government where constitution vested them the authority to act independently. However, if there is now any of these branches of the government exercise grave abuse of discretion, we have now to look back on our constitution, where courts now have the discretion to check whether there is a grave abuse of discretion on such acts. Alright, next slide would be doctrine of constitutional supremacy, where it states that our Philippine Constitution is our basic and paramount law, which all other laws must conform, even the highest officials of the land must defer. Thus, it is deemed written in every statute and contract. Now, for an instance, if the law, contract, or statute did not conform with the Constitution, then it's null and valid. It is null and void or without any force and effect. Now, we have to remember the supremacy of the Constitution, where it is the highest law of the land. It is supreme and absolute, right? It is mentioned there that it is deemed written. No, the deemed written means it is written into every law and contract, not literally. It means that when creating a law or when creating a contract, we don't literally write the Constitution, the 1987 Constitution, and so on. Deemed written means even if it's not literally there, it is being considered. Because if it's not considered, then that law or that contract is null and void or without any force and effect. So it's the supremacy of the Constitution, of course. Now, with regard to referring to the Constitution, courts, when courts interprets the Constitution, they read the Constitution, they use the plain meaning of the words, of course, like how the regular people would understand it. However, if there's ambiguity, if it's unclear, they look at the writer's intention, what the writers meant and what's fair for them while creating the Constitution. So they don't just guess or add things that aren't written. Now, if there's ambiguity, if there's issue regarding with the interpretation of the Constitution, they always refer back to the framers of the Constitution. So yeah, that's pretty much about it, and I hope you have learned something from the subtopics that I've discussed. Thank you so much.
Now, we move on to another fundamental concepts in the law and government, the rule of law. This stands as the cornerstone of a just and orderly system of governance. It's what keeps justice consistent and predictable. Without it, laws would depend on who's in charge, not on what's right. Now, to understand this principle more clearly, let's look at a line that perfectly captures its essence. Ours is a government of laws and not of men. This means that in our system, authority rests on written laws, not on personal will or emotion. The law must be the supreme authority, not the people who enforce it. If the leaders act based on personal preference or anger, society would fall into chaos. The law exists to protect everyone equally, to keep decisions fair, and to prevent power from being abused. That's what makes the law our highest standard. It governs, even those who governs us. But even though laws are supreme, they must still be just. That brings us to the next important idea. In a true government of laws, it isn't enough to simply follow what's written. The rule should be law with justice, not justice in accordance with law. This means that the law itself must be fair, because written laws can still be unjust if they go against moral truth. We measure laws not only by legality, but also by morality, by what philosophers call super or suprapositive laws, or the higher moral standards. Justice in true essence must always reflect what's right and wrong according to the rational nature of moral beings. So it's not blind obedience to the law that defines justice. It's making sure that our laws serve what is moral and human. So let's see how this idea was tested in a real case. So now we have here the case of People versus Veneracion in 1995. So in this case, two people were found guilty of rape with homicide. So if you read this case, it was actually a horrible story. So it was a crime punishable by death under Article 335 of the Revised Penal Code as amended by Republic Act 7659. However, Judge Veneracion refused to impose the death penalty. He chose reclusion perpetua instead, explaining that he was personally against capital punishment for moral and religious reasons. So that leads us to the main issue the Supreme Court had to decide on. So the issue in the case was whether a judge has a discretion to impose a lesser penalty than what the law requires based on personal beliefs. So in other words, does personal conscience have a place when applying the law? So the Supreme Court gave a very clear answer. So the court ruled that judges have no discretion to deviate from the penalty fixed by law. Once guilt is proven, the judge must impose the penalty prescribed by law. No exceptions. As simple as that. Personal morals, emotions, or religious views cannot override legal duty. The law clearly stated that rape with homicide was punishable by death, leaving no room for modification. This ruling reminds us that under the rule of law, justice must come from consistency, not personal opinion. Justices are bound to uphold the law as written. Next, let's look at another case that deals with government power and what happens when it's beyond the law. So another case we have is Villavicencio versus Lucban in 1919. In this case, Mayor Lucban of Manila tried to exterminate vice. In other words, to eliminate prostitution by deporting about 170 women who were sex workers bound to Davao without their consent. The women were detained and transported against their will. They didn't even know where they were going to. So they were actually deprived of liberty and due process. So what exactly did the Supreme Court had to decide here? So the Supreme Court decided on whether the mayor and the chief of police had the legal authority to forcibly relocate private citizens without due process. Basically, could a public official take away someone's freedom just because he thought it was the right thing to do? So the court's ruling was a strong defense of liberty and due process. So here, the court ruled that the Mayor's Act was illegal and unconstitutional. It violated the women's right to liberty and due process. The judiciary had to step in to protect them, reminding everyone that the law must always prevail over personal will. The decision emphasized that no public official, no matter how high, is above the law. So, bisag mayor pa siya, he doesn't have a right to do so. This case shows that even intentions can become unjust if they violate the law. The rule of law exists precisely to stop the government from turning into a government of men, one ruled by personal power instead of legal authority. So we don't tolerate that. The law and government does not allow men to rule over law. Now that we've seen how the courts protect justice, let's reflect on what makes them the true guardians of fairness. So the courts can be known as the hatchery of justice because justice can bloom only in courts when reason prevails over rage. That means decision must come from calm thinking, not anger or pressure. The flame of justice can't be fueled by mob mentality or public outrage. True justice relies in reason, facts, and fairness, not emotion. Judicial independence depends on this. Judges must decide based on the law and evidence, even if the public opinion says otherwise. That's what keeps justice pure. And speaking of supremacy of the law, there's one quote that perfectly sums this up from Justice Miller. No one is above the law. So, Justice Miller once said that the law is the supreme power in our government, and everyone who accepts public office is even more bound to submit to it. So in short, the higher your position, the greater your responsibility to follow the law. power doesn't free anyone from accountability, it just deepens it. This is the true spirit of the rule of law, that the law reigns supreme even over those who make and enforce it. Let's now connect this to how government agencies operate through administrative rules and regulations. As we all know, administrative agencies issue rules to help implement the law, but these must always follow the law's purpose. As the text says, regulations should be germane to the objects and purpose of the law and must not contradict it. This means that government agencies can clarify the law, but they cannot change it. This keeps every action under the control of law, preserving order and fairness. So now let's move on to the next principle. So while the rule of law ensures that laws govern everyone equally, republicanism tells us where that power comes from. But first, let us define what a republic really means. A republic is a form of government where citizens participate in governance. It means everyone has the right and opportunity to take part, either directly or through elected representatives. It's the opposite of a dictatorship or monarchy. In a republic, the people are not ruled, they rule through the laws and officials they choose. And this is clearly stated in our own constitution. Under our 1987 constitution, under Article 2, Section 1, our constitution declares the Philippines is a democratic and republican state. Sovereignty resides in the people and all government authority emanates from them. This means all power in government comes from the people, not from the president, not from the Congress, but from us. Officials are only caretakers of authority that belongs to the people. Now that we know where power comes from, let's understand how it operates under republicanism. So, what is republicanism? Republicanism means representative government. Citizens elect leaders to represent their will, but those leaders must remain accountable. It's based on democratic ideals, freedom, equality, and rule of law. And it reinforces that no one is above the law. Government power comes from the consent of the governed. So, power in a republic is not owned, it's borrowed from the people. To see this principle in action, let's examine a case. So, in this case, we have Aquino Jr. versus Comelec. Senator Ninoy Aquino and other petitioners challenged President Marcos's authority to issue decrees for a 1975 referendum. They argued that Marcos lacked legal authority under both the 1935 and 1973 constitutions, and therefore his actions were invalid. So, what issues did the court have to resolve here? So, the issues were whether President Marcos lawfully held authority to issue those decrees and whether his actions during martial law were valid under the 1973 Constitution, particularly in relation to the people's sovereignty. Now, let's hear what the Supreme Court decided. The court ruled that sovereignty resides in the people and that their will, expressed through referenda, validated President Marcos's actions. In other words, the people's participation gave legitimacy to his authority under the 1973 Constitution. This ruling, though controversial, reaffirmed a vital point. In a Republican state, power always comes from the people. Government only acts legitimately when it reflects their will.
Another concept about laws and government is public accountability and democracy. So, public accountability. Public accountability means that government positions are not personal privileges, but responsibilities given by the people to serve the common good. As we all know, that public office is the public trust. Public accountability is to serve the people with utmost responsibility, integrity, loyalty, and efficiency, act with patriotism, justice, and lead modest lives. Public officials are entrusted with power and resources to act in the best interest of citizens, not for personal gain or advantages. The statement reminds public officials that public service is a noble duty. It's about serving others with honesty, fairness, and self discipline for the good of the nation. Also, in public accountability, we must maintain at all times the highest degree of honesty and integrity, and should be made accountable to all those whom he serves. The Civil Service Commission. The 1987 Constitution describes the Civil Service Commission as the central personnel agency of the government and is principally mandated to establish a career service and adopt measures to promote moral, efficiency, integrity, responsiveness, progressiveness, and courtesy in the civil service, and is also tasked to strengthen the merit and reward system, to integrate all human resources development programs for all. The most highlighted part of about Civil Service Commission in regards to public accountability is to develop and implement policies to improve the performance and welfare of the civil servants. So, next is democracy. Democracy is a form of government in which the sovereign power resides in and is exercised by the whole body of free citizens, directly or indirectly through a system of representation. In other words, in a democracy, the sovereign power, meaning the ultimate authority, belongs to the people. Citizens have the right to take part in governing the country either directly by voting on laws or important issues themselves, or indirectly by electing representatives who make decisions and create laws on their behalf. This system ensures that the government's power comes from the consent of the governed, and not from a single ruler or a single group. And also, democracy embraces at its necessary components freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, and freedom in the pursuit of happiness, including economic freedom and the freedom of enterprise within reasonable bounds and under proper control. Now let's take a look on the case of Guido versus Rural Progress Administration on how democracy is exercised. The facts includes petitioner Justa Gigido, the owner of two adjoining lots in Maypaho, Caloocan, Rizal, which are partly commercial. Respondents Rural Progress Administration, a government agency tasked with acquiring land for subdivision and resale to tenants or occupants. This case involved a case of exploration of two adjoining lots of petitioner, partly commercial, with a combined area of 22,655 square meters situated in Rizal, wherein it prohibits respondent with the said proceeding because the said land sought to be exploited is commercial. So, the issue here is the land sought to be exploited commercial and therefore within the purview of the provisions of Act 539? So, the court's ruling is the petition is granted without special findings as to cost. The court emphasized that the exploration of land must serve a genuine public purpose, benefiting a substantial number of people and promoting public welfare. The court reasoned that the condemnation of a small property for the benefit of a limited number of individuals does not sufficiently ensure to the benefit of the public. The court found that the expiration was primarily for the economic relief of a few families, lacking any consideration of public health, public peace, or other public advantages. So, in a democracy, government interventions like expropriation should benefit the public, not just a parties. The decision warns against co opting public power for a narrow interest. That is why the Supreme Court granted the petition. It's because the requirement that the expiration be for a widespread public good aligns with democratic ideals. Government actions should serve society as a whole and not as a selective groups.